Is there any kind of movement that will attempt to abolish not only slavery in Tennessee, but abolish slavery in the prison system as slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution?
Right, well, I think to the extent there is a mass movement exists in that we've seen a real shift in the national conversation about mass incarceration and about the fact that while incarceration for periods of time may be defensible, mass incarceration is not. And that mood has certainly shifted. So when people ask me sometimes, am I in despair or pessimistic since the election? Because of course CCA or Core Civic, whatever they want to brand themselves, their stocks were down prior to Trump being elected. And of course, as soon as he got elected, they shot right back up again. No, we are in
anticipation of what?
That he would, of course, want to increase privatization. So the feds had issued indications that they were going to pull out the private prison business, that there was no indication that they actually saved money, which they don't, which may be another discussion for another show. But also they certainly aren't as safe and aren't as well run. But we're not pessimistic because 85% of prisons are state prisons, not federal. And this is an issue that still, that criminal justice reform is a really big deal right now across this country because the way things have been occurring since the mid-90s, it doesn't make economic sense. It's not good policy. It doesn't make communities safer. It's not realistic about issues like recidivism. And as we said before, it is destroying communities. And so...
Well, it seems that the only visible thing is that it's making a lot of people a lot of money.
Well, it is making a lot of people a lot of money.
Now, that's a very, very expensive situation, and it brings in a lot of money.
Right.
And they're using just a minimal amount of that money for the upkeep and the running of the prisons.
Right.
Is that?
Well, it's certainly not being spent on food that's edible. It's definitely not being spent on health care. I mean, one of the things we did was we worked to organize a lawsuit concerning hepatitis C, which is being untreated, basically, in Tennessee prisons. When we filed that suit, there are almost 3,500 prisoners that the system knew about who had hepatitis C, and 8 were receiving treatment at the time. I mean, so, I mean, they're certainly not providing for programs to reduce recidivism because, okay, let's say you work at a Core Civic prison. Let's say you work for a private prison. What is your incentive to actually introduce good quality programming? What's your incentive to keep families together? What's your incentive to try to help encourage visitation instead of prohibit visitation? What's your incentive to really want to make sure that person doesn't come back? You don't have any incentive because I promise you, you have shares in the corporation that you work for. I mean, this is common sense.
And the only incentive is to bring more people in, because the more people you bring in and paying them at 13 cents an hour.
Yeah.
I mean, $13. I'm leaning toward 13. 13's actually 13 cents an hour. That's no compensation at all.
And the guys are reaching out to get those jobs because it gives you an opportunity to get out of the cell and to be active, you know, to move around and stuff.
Either you become involved in some kind of some labor kind of activity, or you sit in your cell all day.
Yeah.
Is that? Are you given that choice?
Pretty much, sitting around doing too much of nothing. You know.
Well, you also have the choice to not work, and if you choose not to work, then you're written up for disciplinary, right? And then you go to solitary confinement, which your mental health then begins to deteriorate.
And so you're really forced to, in a real sense, to work in a prison, some kind of employment. Every person in prison has some kind of employment. Is that true?
Well, no, not every person, because there aren't enough jobs. But people would prefer to be active, right? Anyone who thinks that prisoners have it easy, what is it, 3 hots in a cot, are completely disconnected from the reality of the prison system today.
For sure.
But do we have time? We've got this. We're talking about prison reform. There are a number of very good reform bills, and sponsored by Republicans, not just Democrats, but by Republicans in the Tennessee legislature this session. So there is reason to be optimistic.